The 1300s, across northern Europe, the fields began to fail. The rain would not stop. Grain rotted before it could be harvested. Grass turned to mud. Livestock starved the same pastures that were supposed to feed them. This was the start of what historians now call the Great Famine of 13 to 17, years of relentless bad weather and collapsing harvests that hit England, France, the Low Countries, and much of Germany all at once. Some regions would not fully recover until around 1322. Food prices did not just rise, they exploded. In parts of England, prices roughly doubled within a matter of months. In Lorraine, wheat reportedly climbed by more than 300%. Bread, the one thing everyone depended on, became a luxury almost overnight. In many towns and cities, historians estimate that somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population died during those famine years. Not from war, not from plague, from hunger, and from the diseases that hunger invites in. There was no supermarket to fall back on, no global shipping network to bring in grain from somewhere else. When the local harvest failed, there was often nothing behind it. So here is the question this story is really about: what happens when the land that feeds people stops giving food back? To understand that, you have to understand something most people never think about: how fragile a harvest actually was, long before anyone knew why. Before modern fertilizing was not really about growing food. It was about gambling with survival, one season at a time. Here is the math that made it so dangerous. In a good year, a medieval farmer might plant 1 seed and harvest around 7 in return. That's sonorous until you remember that one of those 7 had to be set aside immediately. Not eaten, not sold, saved to plant next year's crop. In a bad year, that same seed might return only 2 for 1. Set 1 aside for next year's planting, and almost nothing is left over to actually eat. Do that math across a whole village, a whole winter, a whole family. A single weak harvest was not just a bad year. It could steal food from the present and the future at the same time. A bad harvest did not just steal today's food. Seed. Before modern fertilizer, a failed field could become a death sentence. And here is the part almost nobody was thinking about at the time. Even when the weather cooperated, the soil itself was quietly losing something, year after year. It's like a gift. Grain fills the barns, straw gets bundled, animals graze and grow fat. People eat, and life continues. But every harvest is also a withdrawal. Grain leaves the field. Straw leaves the field. Animals and people consume what the land produced, and very little of it goes back into the ground it came from. Take enough harvest without giving anything back, and the soil grows tired, thinner. Every harvest looked like a gift, but it was also a withdrawal from the earth. Nobody in the 1300s, or for thousands of years before that, understood nitrogen, phosphorus, or soil biology. There were no scientists measuring nutrients in the dirt. Yet, somehow, farmers were about to stumble onto one of the most important discoveries in human history. They just didn't find it in a laboratory. They found it in a barnyard. Long before anyone understood why, farmers noticed something strange. The grass around the animal pens grew greener, thicker. Somehow, the exact patch of ground where the animals stood and slept and left their waste behind was the most alive patch on the whole farm. They noticed something else too. When dung mixed with straw and old bedding, and that mixture was left to break down, it turned the soil darker, softer, and crops planted in that dark, soft soil seemed to grow with more strength than crops planted anywhere else. The first proof was not written in a book. It was growing under the animals' feet. This was not science. Nobody was testing soil samples. It was observation, repeated across countless seasons, in countless villages, by people who simply paid attention to what worked. Once that pattern was noticed, it could not be unnoticed. The answer to hungry soil was not glamorous. It was not clean. People had disgusting. The answer was waste, animal dung, straw soaked in it. The very thing people stepped over, scraped off their boots, and tried to get away from. That was the thing the fields needed most. The people stepped over became the thing the soil was waiting for. This was not a new idea invented in medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence suggests that organized use of manure on crop fields goes back at least 7,000 years in parts of Greece and Central Europe. Long before anyone wrote a word about farming, humans across different regions had already landed on the same uncomfortable solution. For a farmer, a pile of manure was not garbage. It was next year's harvest. But why did something so simple actually work? You don't need a chemistry degree to understand this, and neither did the farmers who figured it out first. Manure put back some of what the harvest had taken away, returned nutrients to soil that had been stripped bare by growing crops season after season. It changed the structure of the dirt itself, making it looser and easier for roots to push through. It helped the ground hold onto moisture instead of drying out and cracking under the sun. and it added organic matter, old plant material, broken down waste, that gave the soil something to hold on to, something alive. In simple terms, the fields were losing strength every time something was harvested from them. Manure was one of the only ways to give that strength back. It wasn't magic. It wasn't even understood. It just worked, and that was enough to change how farming was done for thousands of years afterward, which meant something people once tried to throw away had just become something they desperately needed to keep. Once farmers understood the pattern, waste stopped being trash. It became a resource worth protecting. Farms began saving manure deliberately. Animal pens were positioned so the waste could be collected. Straw was mixed in on purpose, not just left by accident. What started as something to clean up became something to store, manage, and spread across fields with real intention, almost like planting a second, hidden crop before the visible one ever went into the ground. The soil that fed people was now, in part, being fed by the very people and animals it had once fed. But not everyone saw waste the same way, and that difference would eventually create an entire economy. In a growing town or city, waste was a problem. Disease. It piled up faster than anyone wanted to deal with, and city leaders spent enormous effort trying to get rid of it, hide it, or push it outside the walls. But just outside those same walls, farmers looked at that exact same waste and saw something else entirely. The city saw filth. The farmer saw next year's bread. This gap between what a city wanted to throw away and what a farm desperately needed was about to turn something disgusting into something valuable enough to trade. In parts of the world went even further than animal waste. Human waste itself became a product. In China, human feces and urine were used as fertilizer for centuries, collected and applied to fields as a normal part of agricultural life. In Edo period Japan, human waste, often called naito, was systematically gathered from cities and sold directly to farmers who depended on it to keep their soil productive. It wasn't treated as equally valuable, either. Waste collected from wealthier households, whose diets were richer, was sometimes considered more valuable than waste from the poor, because what people ate changed what came back out, and richer diets meant more nutrients returning to the soil. Become a commodity. Something with a price. Something people would collect, transport, and sell, simply because the alternative, depleted soil and empty harvests, was so much worse. And from here, the story only gets bigger. Because if human and animal waste could feed a farm, and a farm could feed a village, then what could feed an entire kingdom? Follow the chain far enough, and manure stops looking like a farming detail. It starts looking like the foundation of political power. Healthy soil grew stronger harvests. Stronger harvests fed villages without collapsing into famine. Villages that didn't starve could grow into towns. Towns that produced source food could pay taxes. Taxes funded armies, and armies were what kept a kingdom standing against its rivals. Somewhere at the very bottom of that entire chain, underneath taxes, underneath armies, underneath crowns and castles, was a pile of manure quietly keeping a field alive. This is the part almost no history lesson mentions. But it's about to get even stranger, because the next chapter of this story involves an ocean, a bird, and one of the strangest gold rushes in history. By the 1800s, farms across the world were running into the same old wall. Manure worked, but it was limited. There was only so much waste a farm's own animals could produce, and only so much good it could do on already tired soil. Then word began to spread about something found off the coast of Peru. On a chain of small islands, seabirds had been nesting for thousands of years, leaving behind layer after layer of droppings that dried in the sun and never washed away in the near-rainless desert climate. Over centuries, those droppings had piled up into cliffs, dense, rich, and packed with exactly the nutrients that farms across the world were starving for. Bird droppings became so valuable that countries started claiming islands for them. This was guano, and it was about to become one of the strangest treasures in the history of global trade. Guano did more than help crops grow. It made people rich, and it made a country famous almost overnight. Between 1840 and 1880, Peru sold roughly 20 million tons of this dried seabird waste to farms around the world, earning enormous profits along the way. In 1870 alone, Peru exported more than 700,000 tons of guano. Ships lined up. Fortunes were made. What was once bird waste on a remote island had become one of the most sought-after materials on Earth. Farmers who had spent generations scraping together manure from their own animals were suddenly buying shipments of concentrated bird droppings from the other side of the world, because it worked even better. And when something becomes that valuable, people don't just want to buy it, they want to own where it comes from. In 1856, the United States passed something called the Guano Islands Act. It allowed American citizens to claim any unclaimed island, as long as that island contained guano. Think about that. Not gold and oil. Bird droppings were considered valuable enough to justify a law about claiming entire islands. Under this act, around 94 islands were claimed by American citizens. By 1903, 66 of them were officially recognized as United States territories. An empire built, at least in part, on the strength of dried bird waste. But behind the profits and the politics, there was a much darker story happening on the ground, or rather, in the guano itself. Digging up decades' worth of hardened bird droppings, in blistering heat, on isolated islands, was not glamorous work. It was brutal. In Peru, enslaved were used in the earliest years of guano mining. Later, Chinese laborers were brought in under conditions that were harsh, exploitative, and often inescapable. Chinese workers made up around 2/3 of all guano miners in Peru. The waste that fed fields also buried workers alive. Behind every ship that sailed out loaded with guano, there were people who suffered to fill it. The fertilizer that helped farms across the world grow more food was, for the people mining it, one of the harshest labor systems of the era. Yet even guano, as valuable as it was, could not last forever. Guano deposits, built up over thousands of years of seabirds nesting on the same islands, were not infinite. Decades of aggressive mining stripped many of the richest deposits bare. At the same time, the world's population was growing. More people needed more food. Manure alone could not scale to feed a planet. Guano could not scale to feed a planet either, no matter how many islands were claimed. Humanity had reached the edge of what waste-based fertilizer could provide. The old solution had carried civilization for thousands of years, but it was running out of road. So the next breakthrough would not come from a farm or an island. It would come from a laboratory, and it would involve something nobody expected: the air itself. In 1909, a chemist named Fritz Haber achieved something that sounded almost impossible. He found a way to pull nitrogen directly out of the air and turn it into ammonia, one of the key ingredients soil needed to grow strong crops. Nitrogen makes up most of the air around us, but in its natural form, plants can't use it. Haber's process changed that. Soon after, another chemist, Carl Bosch, figured out how to take Haber's discovery out of the lab and scale it up into massive industrial production. Together, their names became attached to what is now called the Haber-Bosch process. After thousands of years of feeding soil with waste, humans learned to pull fertilizer from the air. It was one of the biggest turning points in the entire history of food. But like almost everything in this story, it came with a shadow. The same nitrogen chemistry that could feed a starving field could also fuel an explosion. The chemistry that fed fields could also feed battlefields. Ammonia produced through the Haber-Bosch process wasn't only used to grow crops. It was also a key ingredient in explosives, and that mattered enormously during World War I, when nations needed both bread for their people and munitions for their armies, often drawing from the very same industrial chemistry. The discovery that promised to end hunger arrived at the same moment the world was tearing itself apart. Fertilizer and firepower, born from the same reaction. Despite that dark side, the impact of Haber-Bosch on human survival is almost impossible to overstate. Today, ammonia-based fertilizers produced through this process are estimated to support nearly half of the world's population. Roughly 1/3 of all global food production each year depends on nitrogen pulled from the air through this exact chemistry. Think about that number. Without it, close to half the people alive today might not have enough food to survive. The old problem never disappeared. We just built factories big enough to fight it. But even with factories that can pull fertilizer from the sky, the oldest lesson from the barnyard has never actually gone away. Modern chemical fertilizer is powerful, but it doesn't do everything that manure and compost do. Soil is not just a container for nutrients. It's alive organic matter and microscopic life that chemical fertilizer alone cannot replace. Manure and compost still add that organic material back into the ground, still improve structure, still help soil hold water, and still support the living systems inside the dirt that keep it healthy over the long term. Even now, with satellites, laboratories, and industrial ammonia plants, farmers still use manure and compost, not because they lack better options, but because some of what waste gives to soil, nothing else fully replaces. The oldest answer to hungry soil is still one of its best answers. Manure never looked like treasure. It never shined like gold. Years, it helped keep fields alive. Fields fed villages. Villages grew into towns. Towns paid taxes. Taxes supported kings, raised armies. And armies defended kingdoms. Not bad for something people threw away. From a famine-stricken field in 1315, to a barnyard clue nobody could explain, to islands claimed for bird droppings, to a laboratory pulling fertilizer from the open air, the story keeps circling back to the same simple rule. Things take from the soil, something must go back. Kingdoms rose and fell. Chemistry changed everything. But that one rule, first noticed by farmers who didn't even have a word for nitrogen, is still true today. The soil remembers what it's given, and it never forgets what it's owed.